this will become a watershed when there were either the collapse of the post-war world order, or a major reconfiguration. Now, I hope it will be a major reconfiguration. But the days of Europe, including Britain, freeloading on America for its defense while spending everything it has on welfare is over.
On the agenda this morning, the Prime Minister says he's ready to put British troops on the ground in Ukraine, but won't spend more than 2.5% of GDP on defence. The former commander of land forces in the British Army, General Sir Nick Parker, told us Starmer should not rush into things.
It does seem to be a little bit early to start talking about sending troops to Ukraine when there's a hot war going on, a brutal hot war going on. And I'm very nervous of the term peacekeeping. If you're going to deploy something into an environment where you're expected to keep the peace, you have to fight, and that requires all the military capabilities.
So what military role could the UK play, and will Europe also commit troops? Wes Streeting told us Europe faced an existential question, that political cliché, but wouldn't put a number on how many soldiers the UK could send.
Keir Starmer says he wants to be a bridge between Europe and the US, but the American Vice President, J.D. Vance, says European states are retreating from fundamental values. Patrick Deneen is a friend of Vance. He told us Europeans should listen.
I think he was really trying to say Europe has a real challenge that in terms of how it will incorporate those critiques of its own course, of its leadership, in ways that will show a kind of respect rather than condescension or dismissiveness toward its own citizenry.
I mean, the theme of this year has been who is setting the global agenda, and there's only one answer to that. It is Donald Trump, not just on Ukraine. Since his inauguration, Elon Musk, who's head of the Department for Government Efficiency, has cut jobs and frozen US aid. But can we learn from what he's doing? The Sun has found that UK foreign aid projects include electric cars in Albania, poetry in Colombian jails, and studying shrimp health in Bangladesh. The Sun's chief political correspondent, Jack Elsom, told us we got too used to wasting money.
In this country, we seem to have almost baked in that waste and splurging taxpayer money seems to be just part and parcel of politics. And you've been around the block for a long time. How many times have we heard politicians say they're going to come into government, cut waste, but then nothing happens? So we're just pointing out a few examples where Labour might want to start.
And a report has found a quarter of UK employers plan to cut jobs before Labour's national insurance increase kicks in. Does Labour need to do something urgently to mitigate the tax rises? It
is 6 minutes past 9. Let's start, Andrew, off on I suppose the main issue of the day, in so far as it relates to Europe, is Keir Starmer going to Paris to talk to European leaders about the future of Ukraine. He wants to act as a bridge between the US and Europe when it comes to peace talks. But Donald Trump has been speaking to Vladimir Putin, and Vladimir Putin alone. Starmer's cabinet colleague Wes Streeting was on this programme earlier, told us this was more than just a problem for Ukraine.
It is an existential question for Europe as a whole. That's why the gathering today is important. Next week he'll be travelling to Washington to meet with President Trump, no doubt relaying the outcome of some of those discussions today. Britain is prepared to do whatever it takes to guarantee our collective security and to make sure that not only do we bring an end to the war in Ukraine, but we bring about a lasting peace as well that guarantees Ukrainian freedom, security and democracy, and British freedom, security and democracy too.
If whatever it takes is tens of thousands of troops to police that border as part of a peacekeeping deal, would we be prepared to do a recruitment drive for the armed forces?
Well, look, I think it's premature to be talking about numbers it
isn't though, is it? Because with respect, if the Prime Minister is going today to a meeting of European leaders to ask them to do the same, you do need to be talking about numbers, because it's very clear that this is happening quite quickly now. So do we have an idea of the scale of troops that we would be able to send? Do we know?
Look, the Prime Minister set out his argument today, and no doubt will be saying more during the course of today. I'm not going to get into a game of speculating about numbers.
That was Wes Streeting earlier on the programme. Andrew, are we in the danger of being, and maybe this is just reality, the worst of both possible worlds here, that there's a deal that exists outside of us between Putin and Trump, and yet we're challenging ourselves to enforce that deal once it gets delivered to us on a plate? That doesn't feel like those two things necessarily fit together.
No, indeed, it's kind of low-level geopolitics failed. The Prime Minister talking about committing British forces to peacekeeping, and we don't even know the nature of the peace. We don't even know if we'll be involved in helping draft that peace. I mean, I do think it's time for a rain check on a number of these things. First of all, this business that Britain is going to be a bridge between America and Europe, I've heard that said by prime ministers again and again. It is self-conceited nonsense. America doesn't need a bridge to Europe. America knows where Europe is. It doesn't need us to point a bridge that it needs to cross. And the idea that Keir Starmer is going to recreate with Donald Trump a kind of Reagan-Thatcher or even Bush-Blair relationship is for the birds. It isn't going to happen. So that is just nonsense. And on the idea that we're going to pony up 10,000 peacekeepers. Well, first of all, sometimes you think that politicians say these things to grandstand on the international stage when the domestic situation is dire. And that may well be the case at the moment here. And also, could we provide 10,000 troops? You know, we are incapable at the moment of providing a full war-fighting division of 30,000 men. We couldn't do it. We just don't have the men or the material. And 10,000 troops, who else is going to be there? Are the Germans going to put 10,000 troops into Ukraine? I mean, those of us who know our history know that the history of German troops in Ukraine is not a happy one. Are the French going to do that as well? And it's not just 10,000, because you need at least another 10,000 on rotation, and maybe another 10,000 after that. And here's a thought. Doesn't Parliament need to approve this? Prime Minister on his own can't take that decision.
It feels like it feels like panic to me, Andrew. This is a panic meeting in Paris while Rubio goes off to Saudi Arabia to do the actual meeting with Putin. Is it too much to say the whole post-World War New Order is shifting? That this is actually a really big moment where if America turns its back on Europe, to whatever extent we believe it's doing that, this becomes a question about what sort of continent we are, what sort of country we are within that continent. And an awful lot becomes up for grabs then.
It's a watershed. There's no question about that. In the history books, this will become a watershed when there were either the collapse of the post-war world order, or a major reconfiguration. I hope it will be a major reconfiguration. But the days of Europe, including Britain, freeloading on America for its defense while spending everything it has on welfare is over. The Americans are no longer going to take the bill. And we will have to step up to the crease. We, by that I mean Europe, including Britain, and fill in the gaps. Now, if we do it sensibly, there won't be a complete American retreat, but there will be something of an American withdrawal, which Europe will have to fill the gap. We should still be able to depend on America, but not to the extent now. And here's the reason. In Washington, there's not, and people who think, oh, it'll all go away when Trump's no longer president. He's only going to be there for another 4 years. No. There's a Washington consensus among policymakers in both the Democratic and Republican Party that the 21st century threat to America is China, and that America needs to reconfigure its defense and foreign policies to deal with the rising power of China in the Pacific, and that Russia is essentially a regional problem. It's not a global threat to America. It's a regional problem, and the region is Europe. The Americans regard Russia as a failed and corrupt petrostate, and it's up to the Europeans to get their act together with American help, but not as much as now, to deal with the problem of Russia on Europe's eastern borders. The other consensus in America, in Washington, is that even America can't afford to do both. It cannot afford its existing degree of commitment to Europe and deal with the rising power of China on the Pacific Rim. So one has to give a bit for the other to be built up.
And does that make, Andrew Neil, the comments that we've seen from the Trump administration about Taiwan even more significant in light of everything else that's happening today?
Yes, it does, because it's interesting that, you know, people have wondered what Trump's commitment would be to Taiwan. And it seems to be it may be more firm than people thought. And the other thing is that, you know, when I was last in America, I spoke to a number of Americans about this. As they reconfigure to the 21st century being the Pacific century for America, They know they have to build up. And by the way, the kind of forces America needs in the Pacific are entirely different from what's required in Europe. In Europe, it's boots on the ground. In the Pacific, it's largely amphibious. It's Navy rather than Army. It's Marines rather than Army. And what they said to me is, as we now look to take on the rising power of China, we look around at our allies in the Pacific Rim, and they're all stepping up to spend a lot more on defense. Japan, Australia, South Korea, they're all prepared to do their bit in a way that until recently, the Europeans have not. And as one policymaker said to me, we much prefer to be with allies who are prepared to do their bit rather than allies, as in Europe, that we have drag kicking and screaming to do enough to protect their own well-being.
And can we afford, the question that follows from that is, can we afford this? We had a senior figure from the Estonian government on, and he said to Kate, Andrew, he said, we spend 4% of our GDP on defence. Don't you think we've got pensioners who'd like that money? Don't you think we've got kids at school who'd like that money? But no, we decide to spend 4% because we think 4% is right. Now, the question for all of us in this country is, what is the correct level of expenditure on defence, bearing in mind our geographical location, the fact that we're an island, the fact that maybe Russia is not a big threat to Britain, maybe it is a big threat to Britain, but how far are we willing to pony up? How far are we willing to say, all politics is a priority, we need to get to spending more and more on defence, and we're willing to sacrifice some things to do that?
Well, first of all, in the 21st century, geography is not a defense. Being an island is not a defense. We're wide open to missile attack. And unlike Israel or soon to be Germany, we don't have a missile defense system. That is one of the main lacunae in our defense situation. Now, can we afford to do it? I would pose another question. Can we afford not to do it? Because we spend extensively on a welfare state, and yet the demands for welfare are insatiable. Even in France, which spends 57% of its GDP by the government, most of which is on welfare, there are still demands for more and more welfare. Well, what's the use of welfare if you are under an existential threat, as Labour ministers are now saying? And at some stage, we will need politicians to have the guts to say, look, welfare is important. We want our people to have a good standard of living, but we also want the defense of the realm to be a priority in these dangerous times. We need to spend more, and if that means spending less elsewhere, we will have to do that. 2.3% of GDP is not enough. 2.5% is not enough. It's only an extra 5 billion. And even then, Mr. Starmer can't commit to when we do it. 2.65% is not enough, which is what the top brass has said to be arguing for. That's only an extra 10 billion. It needs to be at least 3% and rising. The Poles, who know a thing or two about what happens when you have weak defense and strong enemies on the east and the west of you, they're now spending 4.7% of their GDP on defense. Yeah. I'm not saying we need to go that far, but we need to be 3+ if we're to be credible. We need to be 3+ if we have the ability to be able to deploy a full war-fighting division, or even if we are to deploy a substantial peacekeeping force in Ukraine.
Just before we move off this topic, Andrew, Ali's raised this question via text. Why is Russia considered so powerful? Is there a danger that we're learning the wrong lesson here? That Russia, for all its bluster, for all its pomp, for all of Vladimir Putin, for all the hundreds of thousands of people it's poured into a military zone, its alliance with North Korea, has not managed to take Ukraine. It has not managed really to succeed in any of its military aims. It has shown that it's not a superpower, it's a mediocre power. And if that's the case, this big problem on our doorstep maybe isn't as big as we'd like to think it is. The counter-argument to everything you've just said is, hasn't Russia shown it's not particularly powerful? It is not China. It is not America. It's not Europe. It's actually a country that's pretty much of a failed state, as you were saying earlier, who've poured troops pointlessly into a military area and not got very far with it.
No, that is true. The enemy is not 10 feet tall, but it's still powerful and important. And if there's a ceasefire, some kind of arrangement in Ukraine, that will allow the Russians to regroup, to rebuild their defenses, and therefore to pose as a threat to the Baltic states, to Poland, to other parts of Eastern Europe. And the point the Americans are making is basically the point you're making. They're saying, look, Russia isn't 10 feet tall. but it's powerful enough if you don't start to spend more and improve your defense and military and security capabilities. Danish intelligence recently came out with a report that suggested that within 5 years, without America, Russian forces could be a real threat to Eastern Europe. And therefore, we need to start building up our defenses, our manpower, our missile defenses, in order to deal with that. There could be a last gasp of Russia. I mean, after all, it is a failed petrostate. In some states, fossil fuels will not command the price they do. That's what's paying for the war. But in some ways, that also makes Russia even more dangerous. Perhaps a dying state that once regarded itself as a superpower will see the way of holding on to that status is to take a chunk of Eastern Europe. We must be prepared for that. The danger at the moment is that it could, in 5 years, it could have the capability to do that if America is no longer there. So we need to build the capability to deter that. This is what is now should now be meant by a peace premium. We now need to find the resources to ensure peace through strength. That is the best route to peace and to avoid a war on the eastern borders of Europe, which would be catastrophic for all of Europe, including the United Kingdom.
Andrew Neil, stay there. We're going to talk about how we manage some of those pretty big questions when it comes to the domestic budgets and spending the government is already committed to, especially on foreign aid. We're also going to be talking about the aftershocks from the budget and what we expect to come this week. We've been talking a lot about defence, about Ukraine and Russia on the programme today, as we were last week too, but it's prompted some questions here in Westminster about how the government spends all of our money. Electric cars in Albania, shrimp health in Bangladesh and research of barriers into mental health in Colombia. The Sun today reports some questionable projects being paid out for UK taxes in our aid budget. The Home Secretary Wes Streeting told us that UK needs to give foreign aid.
When it comes to Britain's national self-interest, let alone the common good of the planet, that so much of what the aid budget does is about bringing stability and prosperity to parts of the world that unless those challenges were unaddressed, we would start to see those challenges presenting on our own shores, in our own continents, or indeed our own defence budgets.
I'm sorry, Wes Streeting, but the £133,000 on studying shrimp health in Bangladesh, how would that wash up on our shores?
As I said, Kate, I'm not defending those individual examples, quite the opposite. What I've said is that this is a government that's been in for 7 months, and in that time has chosen to undertake a thorough review of government spending department by department to make sure that taxpayer money is being spent. Can I say that our predecessors made wise choices about where they spent taxpayers' money? Absolutely not.
So Streeting there saying it's the Conservatives' fault. Well, the Shadow Home Affairs Minister, Conservative Alicia Cairns, who was the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee during the last Parliament, defended aid, but said controlling spending was tricky.
The spending on foreign aid that stabilises countries and reduces the threat to the UK is what we should be spending our aid budget on. I have seen our aid budget be spent very well in countries, but I have also sat there with my head in my hand saying, how in the world did this get through the system? And it's an enormous system, so it's very difficult. And it's very difficult to say that ministers should sign off every single piece of spend when sometimes the spend is as low as, in government terms, £40,000.
Yeah.
But yes, we should be very clear-eyed. The aid budget is there to stabilise countries, to improve the situation there so that it's a reduced threat to our country. That's how I see it.
Andrew Neil, how do we deal with this? Because some people say, funding research into shrimps is important in terms of food security, but others say, slash it all, let's have the UK government take on the Trump-Musk-Doge approach. What do you reckon?
Well, it's difficult when you've got, you just, Kate was speaking there to representatives of the two, or still, I suppose, the two main parties in Britain, Labour and Conservative, and they talk rubbish, self-serving rubbish. I mean, can either of them give me an example of where British foreign aid has created stability and prosperity? One single country, where can you point that to be true? I look at prosperous countries in the Pacific Rim, Singapore being a good example. Foreign aid? No, hasn't got rich on that. A lot of our foreign aid goes to Africa, where the only stability is the stability of dictatorship, and prosperity is pretty hard to come by. The British people are a generous people, and I think they think or see international aid as we help the poorest of the poor, people who don't even get enough calories to fill their bellies of a day to be able to function. That is, it is to help those in dire poverty, and then to help those in poverty help themselves. There are lots of ways we can do that. I would suggest the shrimp farming, or as a story I did years ago, creating an Ethiopian Spice Girls group is not quite the way to do it. So it's not that foreign aid is wrong. It is that it's being used for the wrong purposes. And both in America and in Britain, you see the consequences of bureaucratic capture. It is the bureaucracy in both the aid departments that now follows its own agenda, an increasingly woke agenda too, and its own priorities rather than the priorities of the British people. There is some savings to be made, getting back to the priorities I'm talking about, which is a poverty alleviation and helping people to help themselves. But that alone will not provide enough money to provide us with the extra defense spending we need to build up our military.
But somebody sent us a message here saying stabilising countries by normalising things such as homosexuality and transgender means that we get less immigrants. So why should we not invest in the soft power to help prevent more people arriving in the country?
Well, can we tell me how many transgender people have arrived from Africa fleeing their country for that reason?
It's the general point, though, isn't it? Which is that if we invest in these programmes, which we might think on paper sound a bit pointless, they may well go towards helping normalise something in a country which isn't. I mean, you can argue about whether that's something the UK government ought to be investing in, but you could understand the logic for it, perhaps.
I can't see any examples. I mean, these are massive countries with massive problems, and in Africa with increasingly massive populations. Even the rather generous aid we give is nowhere near going to solve these problems, and particularly since a fair chunk of it ends up in the dictator's Swiss bank account. I mean, it's not that long ago I did a story in which a lot of money sent to one African country ended up buying 2 private jets for the dictator. You know, I don't think that was helping homosexuals or transgender people in his country. I just think it's a conceit that it will make a difference. And how long have you got? We've been trying to introduce and encourage prosperity and democratic stability in Africa for most of my life. And it's still a failed experiment. I just don't think it's the way to go. Poverty alleviation, helping people who are starving, of course. People who are the victims of terrible natural events, of course. Trying to think that our aid can transform these societies, I think is almost a post-colonial conceit.
There's that argument that globalisation is money going from the poorest people in rich countries to the richest people in poor countries.
Yes. There was an economist, I think it was an American economist, or maybe it was in the LSE, who said that the way foreign aid is used these days is basically money from poor people in the West being transferred to rich people in the developing nations.
But there is an argument, I mean, because you're a sophisticated man, Andrew, and I suppose the argument is that there must be other ways of improving society than just simply giving food. And you say, well, Africa's still a failed experiment, but there's an argument. It could have been worse. We don't know, do we? There's no controlled experiment with any of this stuff. So if we do something that helps the civic infrastructure of a country. Now, look, I'm not going to argue for studying Thailand's alcohol policies is worth 44 grand. There's clearly going to be some horrendous examples in all of this. But it can't just be as simple as here's some food and that's your lot. There must be other things you can do.
2 things. You say it could be worse. I'd like to think of anywhere that was worse than the Congo at the moment. Yeah. And secondly, I didn't say just food. I said that should be the basic, helping starving people, I think is a noble and a worthwhile aim and a good use of our tax-paying money. But I also said we then need to help people to help themselves. And that would be to get sustainable agriculture and seeds and water irrigation and all the resources that they need to be able to build up their own agriculture, and businesses as well, small businesses, and to begin to get a prosperous market economy beginning to grow in these places. So it's not just feeding people, though there comes time when that should be the priority, because otherwise they're going to starve to death. And that should be a priority of our foreign aid.
Yeah, and when we looked at this before, I remember someone saying to us, the problem is that when people have budgets to spend, Andrew, they spend it at the end of their cycle and they just think, well, we've got 200 grand to spend. Give me 4 things from around the world. I better spend it. Do you think that happens?
Oh, of course, it's like local authorities. You suddenly see all sorts of potholes being filled in at the end of the financial year because they've got these budgets. And if they don't spend them, they're worried they won't get the same amount next year. So they find ways of spending them. And suddenly the potholes that have done in your suspension throughout the year are suddenly by magic filled in. And yes, look, it's a well-established fact of political science that bureaucracies over time, particularly big bureaucracies, develop their own agendas, their own momentum, and their own interests. And in the aid departments, which are not actually that well scrutinized and which don't have the same public accountability because they're not always high on the agenda. And overall, the sums of money are not huge compared to what we spend on welfare or education and so on. They're able to get away with that a lot more, as Elon Musk has revealed, and as The Sun and The Spectator magazine have been doing in this country too. It's a useful exercise to cut out the waste. And I think it is interesting, we've talked about this before on the program, it is interesting that what happens in America, for good or ill, finds its way over to the UK, PDQ. And that's exactly what is happening now. The Spectator and The Sun would not be doing this if it hadn't been for all the stories coming out of Washington about wasted American aid.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a theme of all our conversations, that is. What goes on in America, what happens over here. Andrew, great to speak to you ever. We love having you on the programme. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good luck to both of you. Bye-bye.
That's Andrew Neil there with his thoughts on the issues of the day. It's a new Monday treat for us.